Less than half of Ontario's eligible voters voted in the last provincial election, 49%. As the current election swings into the second week, the question remains, how will each party engage the most disengaged provincial electorate in the country? That's right, us in Ontario. Let's find out. We welcome Nicole Goodman. She's a political science professor at McMaster University in Hamilton. Adam Radwanski, Queen's Park columnist with the Globe and Mail. And Dave Meslin, co-editor of Local Motion, the Art of Civic Engagement in Toronto. And it's good to have you all back around our table here tonight. Okay, we talked, Adam, off the top about the fact that more than half the people didn't vote last time. So what's the key thing the parties have to do this time? Is it get the message out, or is it get the people to actually come to the polls?
There's two different things there. I mean, one of them is broadly, how do you get your message out? And can you be compelling enough? Last campaign, I mean, in fairness, and I'm quite critical of, I guess, the electorate at large for not voting in bigger numbers. In fairness to the electorate, the last campaign was an awfully boring campaign. There was not a particularly good policy debate. It wasn't very compelling. And in fact, it was almost like the party sort of punted most of the major issues until after the campaign. This time it's a little more encouraging, I think, in that you're having a bit of a better debate, particularly between the Liberals and the Conservatives. And you need to kind of engage people in terms of what issues do they care about, can they be passionate about it, and so on. That's kind of the motivation side of things. Then there's also more at the local level. How sophisticated can parties be in their efforts to actually bring out voters? How do they target the message to individuals? Are they using new technologies to do that? All of that. And I think you're seeing all the parties really trying to develop more quickly the way they do that, because they're realizing that with a kind of unengaged electorate, you have to be a little more ambitious and just trying to reach each individual voter.
Nicole, how do you see it?
How do you engage the disengaged? I see it, and I'm generalizing here, there's sort of three groups in the electorate. There's non-voters, which are the people who don't care, they're not engaged. I asked someone who was a non-voter the other day, I said, are you going to vote in the election? What election?
What election? Yeah, sure.
The second group is a group of infrequent or uncommitted voters who vote in some elections, maybe once every 4 years. And then there's the committed voters. So I think for parties, this election, it's going to be key to get out the committed voters, get out, the people who are voting all the time. But also, if they're going to make any headway, it will be in encouraging those infrequent voters, making them feel this election is important enough that they should come out and participate.
Dave, do you have any idea? I like that chart, actually. That makes a lot of sense. Non-voters, the uncommitted, and then the committed. We know the committed are going to show up. What would you say to a non-voter or someone who's 50-50 on whether to vote on the importance of doing this?
I'm not sure if there's a silver bullet. I think we have to almost take a step back and say that it's not even about elections. It's about political disengagement all the time, in between elections, during elections, and there's lots of different societal forces that reinforce that disengagement. Going back to school, we don't teach civics well in high school. And if you don't give people the tools to understand how the system works, they're going to be less engaged when they get older. So that's one example. Mm-hmm. The parties, I think, also really contribute through electoral strategies where they almost intentionally say, forget about those who aren't voting, we don't need them. It's all about identifying those who want to support you and getting them into a database and getting out the vote. And lastly, I would say the political parties, their message is often really uninspiring. It seems almost intentional. It seems counterintuitive. But those placards they wave, they have these, this is a new thing, the last 10 years, the 11 by 17 placards, they wave them at these rallies and none of them say anything. They're so bland and vapid and it turns people off.
Well, they have the candidate's name on them, don't they? Is that the
No,
one
they
you're
usually have
about?
a word like new leader or this is great or you'll be happy or, right?
I got it, okay.
This is leadership. And it's like, what is?
Have you heard anything yet that you think, I appreciate the fact that you think this campaign already is more interesting than the last one and there are sharper differences among the parties. Have you seen anything yet that you think, oh, that's interesting and that could get more people engaged?
I have, and I think what's interesting, particularly the policy the Conservatives are running on, particularly the 100,000 job cuts that Tim Hudak talked about last week, that could have the effect both ways. I mean, I think that's very clearly designed to motivate the Conservative voters to come out. I think their campaign in particular is more about motivation than it is about persuasion. They really want to get their base out. But I think it could have an interesting effect that way while also motivating people who might not vote for them, because it's the kind of thing people are going to talk about. I mean, you're talking about an awful lot of people there. 100,000 people being cut out of about 900,000 jobs, roughly, or a million jobs. Those people all have, friends, family, whatever, who might now be a little more attuned to the fact this campaign is happening. That could work against the Conservatives as well. It's a bold thing to do, but I think the upside there's a little more at stake when you talk about that kind of thing. And I think, I'd like to think, that since last Friday when Tim Hudak made that announcement, people on all sides have maybe been paying a little more attention because maybe that grabbed them a little bit.
Dave, the million jobs, would that be enough to get you out of bed and go vote?
If I believed it was true. So that's a problem.
You're not sold that his plan would create 1 million jobs? Or are you sold that he might lay off 100,000 broader public sector
Now we're
people?
getting into politics. I'm not here to talk about how I'm going to vote. Yeah, creating jobs and saying he's going to cut lots of jobs at the same time, that seems like a paradox to me personally as a voter.
Okay, we know who you're not voting for. We got that. How about, Nicole, this? We've seen this particularly in the United States. It is the job of some party strategists to depress the vote because their party, whichever, does better when fewer people show up. Do we have that dynamic in play in this election in Ontario?
I don't know if anyone really necessarily wants to suppress votes per se, but I don't know if they're really engaged in encouraging any people that don't normally participate to vote necessarily. I think some of the parties will try and mobilize a lot of youth. So I had heard that Hudak is really reaching out on social media, and I'd also heard about the Liberals doing a lot of good things with social media and reaching out. But I don't think anyone is doing anything revolutionary to try and necessarily encourage the vote. I mean, at the end of the day, it's the goal of politicians, of parties, to get elected. So however they can do that, whether that's through rallying additional votes or maybe not encouraging those additional votes, they're going to do that.
Who does it help, generally speaking, Adam, if fewer people show up?
Well, it depends who fewer people are talking about. I mean, I think the conservative theory here would be that they can get more of their supporters out than the other parties can. That by exciting them, it would be easier for them than, say, the Liberals, who have been around a long time, who have more of a pragmatic base and so on. And the Liberals would maybe, I don't know who would benefit most. The Liberals could conceivably suffer most, because how many really passionate Liberals are there out there? To begin with, I mean, it's a centrist party. You don't usually get wildly excited about them. And on top of that, they've been in government a long time. They may be kind of a default option. But I think maybe for them it's a challenge. Then again, that's why I think you've seen them pivot somewhat to a somewhat more left-of-center platform they usually run on, talk about things like a new pension plan that they think will motivate and excite some people. So it's probably the biggest challenge for them. If turnout is quite low, what it really comes down to is which party is better at getting out the people more than it comes down to who's better at persuading, because it means a lot of undecided people just aren't voting at all.
Well, Dave, I know because we're right beside the province of Quebec, we often make those comparisons to the province of Quebec. And in their last general election, which was just a few months ago, they got 71% of the people to come out and vote. And that's actually, never mind it's way better than Ontario, it's down a little bit from last time. They generally have pretty good turnout, and we don't. What's in the water over there that apparently is not in the water in Ontario that gets so many people voting there and so few voting here?
I'm not sure. The good news that I was in Los Angeles last week and they have 20% turnout for municipal elections. When I told them we're at 50, they were like, wow, 50, that's amazing. So there's some good news.
At 20% turnout in LA?
Yeah, for municipal. So we'd see 50 as low, and they were like, 50, wow, we can get there one day. Quebec, well, I mean, it might have to do with the strong social movements we've seen over the last few years, especially the student movements. I haven't seen the demographic breakdowns of whether the bump in turnout was from youth, but that could play a big role for sure. One of the things about the way parties campaign here in terms of getting out the vote is that it actually discourages young volunteers, I think, from being involved. So I once got involved with a campaign 10, 15 years ago, the Michael Valpy campaign in Trinity Spadina. And what they do when you walk in the door and you say, I'm young, I'm passionate about politics, I want to get involved, I want to volunteer, I want to knock on doors and talk about the issues, they say, that's not how it works. We don't talk about issues during a campaign. We're going to give you a clipboard. Your job is to gather data. Or you can sit in this office and do data entry. And that's what an election campaign is. And it's really boring. And it turns away passionate people. And you wrote, actually, in your column this week that parties are having trouble getting volunteers to knock on doors. Well, no wonder. The campaigns they run internally are really demoralizing.
And that was an NDP campaign.
It was, and I haven't worked on one since.
The volunteer thing is a huge problem. And it means that parties these days, they can't rely on reaching voters by phone as much, because a lot of people don't have home phones anymore.
Or certainly won't answer them.
They
know who's on the other end.
Exactly. So you can't reach them by phone. And to some extent, reaching them by phone has been discredited a little bit as a good way of really connecting with them anyway. The more research you look at, the more it suggests volunteers at the door are the way to reach them. But fewer and fewer people volunteer. That means that you're really stuck only getting to a small number of doors. What Nicole said before about the different groups of voters and the kind of infrequent voters, those kind of become the sweet spot a little bit, I think. And if you're a party looking at how many doors can we get to, you try and really narrowly target So you just get to those where you think you have the most impact. So they may not be talking as much to people who never vote because they just write them off and go, okay, who are the ones who we can have the highest chance of actually getting out? It means a lot of people just get ignored altogether during a campaign because you can only get to a small number of your riding's doors.
Sure. But Nicole, one of the things, at least one of the theories I've heard advanced, is that people get sick of politics when they hear on the news all the time, this scandal about the gas plants, that scandal about Orange, this scandal about e-health, this scandal about erased emails and hard drives and so on and so forth. But look at Quebec. I mean, they had the biggest scandal in the country in the past 5 years with all of the ties to organized crime in the building business and the development business, and yet 71% of the people show up. So talk to us about that.
I think there's two things going on here. If you look at provincial election turnout for the past 20 years, you see a steady decline, consistent with the federal elections as well. The two outliers to that are the recent Quebec election and the recent Alberta election. And if you look at both, there was an important issue. There was the education issue in Quebec, and there's the oil sands development in Alberta. So I feel, point one, there isn't really an issue this time around that I think is really going to get Ontarians out in droves. Number two, I think Ontario has a different sort of participatory culture than these other provinces.
Meaning what?
Meaning we don't sort of see Ontarians get really angry about something. Like, look what British Columbians did with the HST. They mobilized a Facebook group. They protested, and now they don't have HST as a consequence of their political participation. We don't see that kind of thing happening in Ontario the same way we see it happening in Quebec and British Columbia.
Do you see that as well?
I do. And look, I agree. We're not an engaged province. I disagree with the point that there's not anything to compel. As I said before, I think there's lots to compel voters in theory in this election. Look, not just with the issues they're running on, but this is a province with a big deficit, with a lot of real economic challenges, with some very uncertain future for its social programs. There's a lot of real issues there. And there are some real alternatives being offered by different parties. The problem is I don't think we're a very engaged province. I think in Ontario, provincial politics here in particular, it kind of slips through the cracks. I mean, we talk about federal politics. We don't have a particularly strong provincial identity. We are obsessed with municipal politics in the Toronto area right now for obvious reasons. And it's very hard to get people just motivated. Believe me, as a provincial columnist, it's very hard to get people talking as much as you would like about Ontario politics.
Do they read your stuff, Adam? Do you know?
Well, the smart ones do. But
the smart ones do, of course.
No, and I'm joking about the smart ones, but there's an engaged core that absolutely will seek out, opinion and columns and so on, and great. But broadly, there's just not the same level of engagement that you get in other places. I just don't think people self-identify as Ontarians quite the same way they do elsewhere, and they sort of write off how Ontario politics is boring and it doesn't have the color of the other levels and so on.
Except that that's not true.
It's not true right now at all. Last election, as I said, I think unfortunately the parties may have proved them right a little bit on that. This time they're not. It would be nice to see people kind of get past that idea of it.
Nicole?
I just wanted to say, you would think when you look at, the economy today that people would be coming out in droves. How many years was Ontario a have province for? And all of a sudden, since 2009, we've been a have not province. And we're facing some real economic challenges, lots of manufacturing job losses. So you would think, if anything, that this would be an important election. Minority government. We just came out of a minority government. We're facing these big economic challenges. We have some of the biggest policy problems we've ever been facing as a province.
Except that if you thought that nobody had any answers to these, what are clearly international problems, you might not get out and vote because you might think it doesn't matter who wins. No one's got an answer to this, right?
Yeah, or I don't trust anyone.
Or I don't trust any of them. Yeah. That's also
the other thing here is there's kind of two Ontarios. You've got the GTA and you've got everywhere else. And in parts of Ontario, like southwestern Ontario, there's a ton of urgency around the economic situation and manufacturing layoffs and all of that kind of thing. Unfortunately, the real battleground in the election is largely in the GTA. In GTA, there is some urgency, but you don't feel that. People aren't really hurting here the same way. They're not as engaged. It's not quite as much of a community sense in a lot of the places in the suburbs as well. So there's just not that same sense of we have a lot at stake here, the way that you would get in a place like Windsor or London, which unfortunately isn't really what will probably decide the election.
Let's play some tape, and then Dave, I'll get you to comment on this tape first. We have done, for many weeks in a row now, let's put the microscope on democracy. And here's a clip of one of our previous segments, and we'll get you to comment after this. Roll tape, please.
You can't really tell what politicians care about. You know what I mean? They all look the same. They all talk the same.
The dialogue is so simplistic that you see in the House of Commons.
It's the talking points. Because I'm there often and I hear the same thing over and over and over and over again.
Slogans turn me off so much. The distilling of a complex, subtle idea to a phrase, it just makes me not want to be a part of it.
It's It's jargon to me. It's very, very hard to slice through. It's completely frustrating.
People need to let politicians say something that's not in a 30-second soundbite, that doesn't have a message plastered behind them every time they go out in public to speak.
I can't even think of a politician in my lifetime who said, I don't know what to do about this. But I hear that from scientists all the time. I hear that from business people. I hear that from entrepreneurs.
It would be wonderful if they could share their subtlety with us in a way that they don't seem inclined to do right now because of the current political climate.
We have one group of people who have expectations of what to hear. We have another group of people who are speaking, it appears, a completely different language. Do you see any middle ground here at all?
I think what would help is if we had more choice. So in a world where everything is driven by increasing choice all the time, compare how many stations were on the punch box on TV when we grew up to what there is now.
Right.
So kids are growing up with thousands of things to watch anytime on their phone. Anything you want to buy, it's choice, choice, choice. And then it's election time, and it's, in the US, red or blue, and here we throw in a green and an orange. Well, just an orange. The greens, that's too much. A fourth choice, we can't handle that.
We do it here.
We actually, TVO, to your credit, is the only media outlet that does it consistently, which is great. But I think it would really help if people felt there was more choice. The three major parties, it's silly to say they're the same, or they're all saying the same thing, but they do gravitate towards the middle. They are risk averse, and they're more likely to use cheap slogans than to take risks and to say what they really believe. And I think that just as in the free market, in the capitalist world, it's the startups and the small companies that are edgy and push the big guys to make, innovations. We need small parties to have a voice. And I think it's only a democracy committed to mediocrity would exclude the Green Party the way they're doing right now, knowing that they appeal to youth as well more than any other party. Mike Schreiner should be in the debates. And I support voting reform. When we talk about voting reform, we usually do it in the context of the math. They got this many votes, but not as many seats. That's not fair. It also affects who runs, how they run against each other, and I think it would increase voter turnout as well. So for example, the Green Party, they got 8% of the vote in 2007. They should have had, 9 or 10 seats at Queen's Park.
That's a different show, man.
I know it's a different show, but I mean, we can't talk about apathy without talking about the fact that we have a voting system that encourages apathy by pushing everyone towards the center and not giving us who we ask for.
Do you think that's fair, that because we don't have proportional representation and therefore some people will allege not every vote counts the same as it in a first-past-the-post system, that suppresses the vote?
I think there's a bit of a problem. Look, I live in Toronto Danforth. I can tell you that in Toronto, I can tell you right now who's going to win Toronto Danforth. Anybody who lives there, who pays any attention, can tell you who's going to win. That probably doesn't help in terms of making people feel their vote counts. And on Dave, I know Dave has been advocating hard for ranked balloting, which would, I think, maybe compel the parties to at least try to speak to a broader audience, because they'd have to try and get 50% of the population to at least be okay with them, which would mean a bit of a broader message.
They'd get a first place and second place.
That's right, as opposed to trying to narrow target and say, well, we only need 35%, so let's just talk to them. Just on the clip there, I do think there's a bit of a vicious circle there. I mean, you've got people complaining that the politicians only speak in sound bites and in slogans. And you've got the politicians saying, well, that's the only way that anybody's going to hear us, because they're not paying any attention. I mean, you've probably heard Tim Hudak say before that, just when you get tired of saying something is when people start actually hearing it. So it kind of feeds into itself. I don't know how you break that, but it is kind of a two-way street.
What did you see in that clip that either gave you some hope or more likely some despair about solving this?
I think that, like I said before, parties try and sell themselves. So if it works for corporations to brand themselves and have their messaging, right, sell their brand, why wouldn't it work for parties? I think increasingly in the past, 10, 15 years, we've seen parties really brand themselves and come into electioneering machines that try and sell their brand.
How about this as a brand? Voting is your civic duty. Get up for an hour on voting day, damn it, and vote. Would that work?
I 100% agree with you. The problem is I don't think young people particularly, feel that there is really any choice. And I was talking to some of my students about this in anticipation of coming on here. And I think, like what Dave said, there is policy differences. Hudak particularly stands out as being a distinct policy differences. But overall, they don't trust these leaders, and they don't see a big difference in terms of who has real leadership. There needs to be a campaign for real leadership, I think, not just at the provincial level, but at other levels of government.
We've got a couple of minutes left. If we're talking about re-engaging the disengaged, how about by law you have to vote? Is that an option?
I don't support that for a few reasons. First of all, I don't think it should be an obligation. And I think teaching it as an obligation and a duty actually sends the wrong message. The truth is, it's in your interest to participate in shaping the world around you, whether it's through being on your residents association or part of a nonprofit or voting. I think that's a more appealing message. The other thing is, it's a really important metric for us to have to see voter turnout, to be able to compare Quebec to Ontario. Forcing everyone to vote means we actually lose the ability to see if our democracy is functioning. I want to know if people want to vote, and I want them to want to vote.
20 seconds, Adam.
Yeah, no, I wouldn't support it either. I mean, look, I wish more people were engaged, but when you've got less than half people voting, and look, we've all talked to people out there about their level of engagement here, I'm not sure they'd be that much more engaged, and I really don't like the idea of people not paying any attention, just going and voting randomly for whichever party.
Well, that's not a bad point, too. You make lots of good points, Adam Radwanski, which is why we read you in the Globe and Mail all the time, because we're smart and we want to be smarter. That's Adam Radwanski, followed by Dave Meslin, Local Motion, the Art of Civic Engagement in Toronto. That's his latest. And Nicole Goodman, Professor of Political Science at McMaster University. Great to have you three around our table here at TVO tonight.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.